In this video, we discuss the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records collection, which was the result of an act of Congress in 1992 to release all the documents held by the federal government relating to the JFK assassination. The purpose of this law was to regain confidence in the federal government that was shaken by the Oliver Stone movie JFK in 1991. It's necessary to revisit the history of the ARRB, the Assassination Records Review Board, which was created by the 1992 Act, because it has its own history, and that history, when it is understood, alleviates a lot of the misunderstandings which has raised questions about the integrity of the board and of the process, designed to clear up the doubt that has circulated around the assassination since 1963. A total of more than 5 million pages of assassination-related records, as you can see from this screen, from the National Archives, has been released in approximately 2,000 cubic feet of records. Many of these records are available in Bethesda, Maryland, at the National Archives' main office building for research. Many other documents are available online. However, the great majority of documents that have been released are not yet online, although getting them all online is the ultimate objective. It is important to understand that the AARB was not about fact-finding. It was not an investigatory body. Its sole purpose was to release the records in an organized fashion where they would be labeled and easily accessible. So, release of the records was the mandate of the AARB, not fact-finding or determining anything whatsoever about the possibility of a conspiracy or no conspiracy. One of the big issues that the AARB had to tackle was the issue of what in the world is an assassination record. The government was not supposed to release records that had nothing to do with the JFK assassination, but the question of what is an assassination record was not immediately clear. At first, the idea was that all of the records that had been assembled by investigatory bodies of the federal government since 1963 would be brought together in one place, and that therefore an assassination record would consist of any document that had been reviewed or kept by one of those investigatory agencies, such as the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and there were also individual Justice Department investigations in the 1960s and the 1980s on a much smaller scale than the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee investigation. But after a time, it became clear that that was too restrictive a definition of an assassination record, and that it would actually inspire suspicion of the federal government because many of those documents were already available, and some of the doubt about the assassination had to do with supposed incompetence in those very investigations and the failure of those investigations to ferret out documents that existed somewhere in the federal bureaucracy. So limiting an assassination record to a record that was found by one of these investigatory bodies seemed to be inadequate to many people, not just conspiracy buffs. So the AARB in the 1990s expanded its definition of an assassination record greatly. The members of the AARB were primarily academics. They were not members of the federal government. They were led by a judge, John Tunheim. He explained that he believed the law always authorized the board to broaden the scope of its definition of an assassination record, and in the 1990s it did so. By 1998, the board defined an assassination record as any and all records, public and private, that were reasonably related to the assassination. This definition is incredibly expansive, and it was followed in the inclusion of records in the collection thereafter. It included the files of the Dallas police. It included the records of Will Fritz, who had interviewed Oswald after the assassination, Fritz working for the Dallas police. It included the records of the Garrison investigation in Louisiana. It included anything that the federal government happened to have copies of that had any kind of connection whatsoever to the JFK assassination. If anything, this definition has created the opposite kind of problem of too many documents to consider, because thousands and thousands of documents that were swept up under this expansive definition had no real relationship to the JFK assassination, as we will see. They just happened to have some relationship to an agency or a concern that had some parallel in the JFK assassination. For instance, many records that had to do with the Cuban Revolution in 1959 were included in the JFK Assassination Records collection, even though those records had nothing to do with the JFK assassination per se. In 1959, John F. Kennedy was a senator. Nobody related to Cuba was considering assassinating him. And yet many of the documents go back to 1959 and earlier simply because they are about Cuba. Cuba figured into the controversy over the assassination after the assassination took place. So anything that had to do with Cuba, starting with the establishment of the Cuban regime under Fidel Castro, was considered to be relevant enough to be related to the assassination, even though it was not. The best way to see this is to look at some documents that were part of the AARB release in 2018. You would think that documents released in 2018 would be potentially highly explosive because it took so long to release them. But in fact, most of them have very little, if anything, to do with the JFK assassination. This is a good example. Look at what this document shows. First of all, this document is from March 27, 1962. It's a CIA document, as you can see. And it says that Mr. Ralph Brent, manager of radio station WRUL in New York City, has informed headquarters that a group of Cuban students has consulted him on starting a program over that station. The group bought and paid for 5 minutes of air time 5 days a week, immediately following the program of Luis Conte Aguero. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with Lee Harvey Oswald. It has nothing to do with the Cuban government. It is simply something that was produced by the CIA for some purpose that is not entirely clear. But because it has something to do with Cuba in a very loose sense of the word, and because Cuba had something to do with the JFK assassination, also in a very loose sense of the word, this one is considered related to the JFK assassination, even though it hardly is. This document has the same degree of relevance to the JFK assassination, which is to say it has no relationship whatsoever. This was also part of the release of documents in 2018, a CIA document that was produced on January 13, 1960, long before the JFK assassination. It talks about a recently announced organization that is blossoming into a political party somewhere in Cuba, based on a document of 15 December 1959, which states that the MDC, this recently announced organization, will soon announce the date of its first National Congress. And it talks about inviting someone from Venezuela to the meeting. Now, this is a minor political party in Cuba in 1960, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Lee Harvey Oswald or the run-up to the JFK assassination. But it is related to Cuba. It's related to the CIA's focus on Cuba in 1960, and so it's considered related to the JFK assassination, even though even the most flexible interpretation of a relationship would probably not include such a document as this. Here is still another document dated June 8th through 9th, 1965, referring to the recruitment of Cuban exiles by Anton Constanzo Palau to join the ranks of the Loyalist forces in the Dominican Republic in their fight against Francisco Camano Dino. Again, this is a CIA document. It's marked secret. It was released by the AARB in 2018. Of course, that means it's declassified. It has absolutely nothing to do with the JFK assassination. It was produced nearly 2 years after the assassination. It only loosely has something to do with Cuba, referring to Cuban exiles, related in fact to the Dominican Republic, not Cuba. And so only in the broadest, most expansive interpretation of a document is this even remotely related to the JFK assassination. And I think even in an expansive definition, we would admit that this has nothing whatsoever to do with the JFK assassination. In fact, it can't have anything to do with it because it was referring to events 2 years after the assassination. And yet, it is a JFK assassination-related document according to the definition of the AARB, and it is one of the 5 million documents that is included in the collection. Another good example of what the collection consists of. This is another gem from the collection. This is from October 1968, marked secret, released in 2018. That means declassified, no longer secret. And it says Alfredo Mirabal Diaz departed Mexico mid-1964. The current Cuban vice consul for Mexico City is Rafael Mirabal Fernandez. He took Diaz's place. Diaz was the successor of the consul who interviewed Oswald, and Diaz himself was included in the interviewing session with Oswald in October 1963. He didn't become the vice consul until after the assassination. All this document does is show that he departed Mexico in mid-1964 and was thereupon replaced by Rafael Fernandez. It is an assassination-related document because, of course, it has something to do with Cuba and it has something to do with Diaz. But this information was readily available in the newspapers and it could be checked in retrospect. It did not require a CIA document to reveal this information, which by itself has nothing to do with the JFK assassination. Nevertheless, at one point it was marked secret. It still contains redacted information, and it was only released in 2018. Another irrelevant document that shows the common nature of documents generally in the collection. Finally, this is another random example of how expansive the definition of an assassination-related document the AARB was using. This is a CIA document that was once classified, but it was declassified before being released by the AARB once again in 2018. It's a document from February 1959. This is before Oswald even went to the Soviet Union. Oswald was in the Marines at the time. This document has nothing to do with Oswald or the JFK assassination. It does, however, have something to do with Cuba, since it's from the chief of station in Havana. And because of that loose association, if you want to call it that, this is included as a JFK-related document, when it really is not. It says it is requested that Michael M. Shodden be instructed to write a letter to the First National City Bank of New York concerning the account that was set up in his name with Kubark funds. He is to instruct the bank that he is the sole owner of the organization described in the account, and that therefore only his signature should be honored for withdrawals. This was some kind of CIA contact, because Kubark was an acronym that was used to refer to CIA funds. So Kubark funds were CIA funds. Evidently, this was to pay his expenses for work on behalf of the CIA in 1959. Once again, this has nothing to do with the JFK assassination, for all we can tell, and it doesn't even suggest a connection. If there were a connection, this document would not help us find out what that was. More likely, this has nothing whatsoever to do with the JFK assassination, but it's included because of the expansive definition of what a JFK record consists of, which is the loosest possible relationship to the assassination. That is, no relationship at all, but a relationship to a federal agency that was asked to provide documentation regarding the Cuba situation going back as far as possible. Good luck with using this to interpret the JFK assassination. Once again, a document with no discernible relationship whatsoever to the JFK assassination. This document from February 1964 was released in June 1993 and was one of the first of the AARB documents released under the 1992 law. It was released by the FBI for the House Select Committee on Assassinations back in the 1970s, and it disclosed to the HSCA the results of interviews conducted by the CIA of associates who knew George de Mohrenschildt, the eccentric, once wealthy Russian émigré who improbably befriended Oswald in 1963. The interviews had evidently been conducted by CIA employees who were given clearances to talk to the FBI, which forwarded the interviews to the HSCA. The security clearances that permitted CIA employees to talk to the civilians at the FBI in 1964 were routine clearances and were called CSAs, Covert Security Allowances. Naturally, the document was unredacted when it was produced in 1964. But in 1993, the FBI redacted the acronym CSA in the 3 places that they appeared in the document, even though the House Select Committee on Assassinations, back in the 1970s, knew all about the CIA's connection to the interviews when it saw the original unredacted document. Why did the FBI hide this information from the public in 1993? Probably because it correctly believed that the provenance of this information from a CIA interviewer was unimportant in the context of the assassination and unrelated to that which was related, the opinions of those who knew George de Mohrenschildt. The FBI was correct that the CSA clearances were not relevant to the question of what the interviewees thought of de Mohrenschildt. And in fact, it could be argued that what the witnesses thought of de Mohrenschildt was only loosely related to the assassination itself. But nothing about their answers was redacted, even in 1993. Ironically, however, 5 years later, with the more expansive definition of what an assassination record consisted of, the AARB released the full unredacted document, with the CSA clearance references fully revealed, as you see here, in accordance with the expansive definition, that anything reasonably related to the assassination would be released. They did not have to unredact the 3 CSA references, because the document that the AARB released in 1998 was the original one held in the Warren Commission files, and as a Warren Commission file, it would have been released in its entirety anyway. The FBI would have had nothing to do with this copy of the document's release. So what this story reveals is a total of at least 4 things. First, 2 or more copies of the same document are replicated dozens, if not hundreds of times in the AARB files, some redacted in part, some completely unredacted. We can therefore show that there is nothing suspicious in the redactions of many documents, because we now can see with our own eyes the underlying information in them, which turns out to be unremarkable and even irrelevant to the assassination. Second, many people, stumbling on the redacted copies only, end up wasting part of their lives tracking down information that we already know the answers to in copies of the same document elsewhere in the AARB files. Third, the redactions result from bureaucracies preferring to release as little information as possible, which is unsurprising, especially when the information is clearly irrelevant to the substance of the disclosures. Fourth, in the subsequent releases of the documents, redactions tend to be fewer and fewer, as in this case, but they still occur because the question of what is reasonably related to the JFK assassination lies, to an extent, in the eye of the beholder. Whether de Mohrenschildt was an atheist and or a womanizer would appear to have nothing to do with the assassination. But just as a student speaking about Cuba on the radio in 1960 has something to do with Cuba, and just because de Mohrenschildt crossed paths with Oswald a few times, regarding him as an uneducated hillbilly, any connection to Cuba or Oswald counts as an assassination-related document, even though these two documents, and many, many others, clearly are not.